So in this class, we are going to look at France during the 1960s, a time of considerable change in France. On the one hand, considerable economic prosperity, but as we will see, by the end of the decade, a great deal of political uncertainty and indeed an air of revolution hanging about the country. So, France in the 1960s, generally a very prosperous place. I mentioned in the previous class that the French economy was growing at about 6% a year over the course of the 1960s. So for many French people, it's remembered as a time it was fondly remembered as a time of growing wealth, growing happiness. French wages increased on average by 50%. Over the course of the 1960s, that is taking inflation into account. So there was basically a lot more French people had more money in their pockets. There was a growing materialism in France as well. So this novel here by Georges Perec, The Things, was about a couple that essentially was obsessed with buying more and more consumer items. So it's an emphasis on, I guess, the growing level of materialism that was evident in France in the 1960s as well. It's really for the first time that France is able to kind of catch up with the kind of materialistic lifestyle we associate with the United States in the post-war period. For example, TVs, refrigerators, washing machines, cars, all these items were actually relatively rare in France in the 1950s, but by 1970, over half of the French households in France have a television. So, or have all of these items. Just to pick one example, the television. There was about 2 million televisions in France in 1960. By 1970, that had increased to 11 million. So there's a substantial growth in terms of the number of material goods that are available in France. And because people have more money to purchase them, their use becomes much more widespread as well. And this has obvious impact on wider French culture. There's also a growing housing boom in France in the 1960s in particular. So this is one of the apartment complexes that were being developed increasingly outside of French cities, or on the edge of French cities, that is. They weren't particularly popular French architects who felt they were too kind of bland, kind of ugly looking buildings. But for a lot of ordinary French people, these apartments, these homes, were much more modern, much more spacious than some of the cramped, rundown places they'd been living in. And because for inner city France, a lot of these older homes essentially were slums. So there was an improvement, I guess, in the quality of life in terms of housing for French citizens as well. What we also see is a growth in education in France. As the French economy is moving towards being more technologically savvy, technologically sound, there's obviously a greater demand for French children to be better educated. So the French state itself in 1959 raises the age of school leaving, mandatory age you must stay in school, from 14 to 16, and therefore we get more students staying in high school, staying in the secondary level education, and then going on to university as well. Between 1954 and 1968, the number of students enrolled in at third level education in France more than doubles. So many of these schools are frankly packed. Just as this image here, we have students sitting in the hallway, and so the universities are packed. More and more students taking classes. The French population in general is better educated and able to kind of adapt to these new jobs that are emerging as France's economy becomes more modern. Intellectually, there's also a series of changes. Some of the most important philosophers of the post-war period, like Jean-Paul Sartre, are still writing, but of course their memory of, or their view of the world is very much colored by France's combating, or France's effort to overthrow the Nazi occupation in the 1940s. There is a new generation of French philosophers, and actually an important moment, I guess, in French intellectual life comes with the death of Albert Camus in an automobile accident. And this is a picture of his car. It was crashed in 1960. It kind of marks an end point of when the French, or I guess transition in French intellectual life from the old or from the thinking of Jean-Paul Sartre and his generation to a new wave of French thinkers. And some of the most important French thinkers in the post-war period were Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist, and Roland Barthes, a French literary critic. Strauss, or Levi Strauss, is important because he essentially brought or introduced the philosophy now known as structuralism. Structuralism came from linguistics. What it basically suggests is that free agency, free will, which people like Sartre and his existentialism had placed such a heavy emphasis on, is largely an illusion. That as human beings, we are kind of trapped in repeating patterns, repeating symbols, repeating meanings that we really can't break out of. So in other words, what Levi Strauss is saying as an anthropologist is if you study any culture in kind of close detail, you'll eventually kind of spot these meanings and these symbols that kind of lie just below the surface of ordinary life, but kind of dictate people's understanding of the world and how they, I guess, make their decisions. Roland Barthes was a critic of the idea of the author as an agent of free will. He basically denied that there was any kind of real control that authors exerted over their own texts, or that they were any kind of real reflection of the real world. Instead, Barthes was arguing that, again, taking up the kind of structuralist argument of Levi Strauss, that what's significant in a text is really the hidden meanings, the hidden symbols we find when we study analyze the text more closely. These are not meanings that the author necessarily meant to enter into his text or her text, but which are evidence of kind of the wider culture in which we live in. Another important philosopher, and obviously prominent given the debates around French colonialism in the late 1950s, is Frantz Fanon, who was a French doctor from Martinique, who went to Algeria during the conflict in the 1950s and wrote a work published near the end of his life. So Fanon actually died relatively young of illness, but The Wretched of the Earth, in which he very much criticized race and colonialism. It wasn't specific to France. He was talking about this more in a global context, the importance of race and colonialism, but his experience were very much shaped by his opinion of the conflict in Algeria, and where he basically was saying that the Algerians were completely right to rise up and overthrow the French, and basically were justified in well, he didn't say justified, but it was not. It was he was unwilling to condemn the kind of atrocities that were committed by Algerians, basically saying they were an understandable consequence of the hatred and racist policies of the French government for centuries. So, of course, these are intellectual trends. Maybe these don't necessarily affect your average French person, but what we do get in France in the late 1960s is also the new emergence of youth culture. For the first time, obviously, we have more and more French people who are in education, having to stay in education longer, who have a certain amount of disposable income, oftentimes in the form of pocket money from their parents. And this creates a new youth culture in France itself, where for the first time, French people, young French people, maybe who are not forced to get a job immediately upon leaving school, are able to take some of this disposable income and use it to purchase music, materials, clothes, whatever it is that reflects their own kind of distinctive way of life. One of the most famous aspects of the new emerging youth culture in France was a French magazine, Salut les copains, Hello Gang, basically, or Hi Gang, was a magazine aimed at French youth. Began published in the early 1960s. By 1962, it is selling over 1 million copies per issue, so it became very, very popular, very, very influential. It staged a concert in Paris in 1963, a kind of pop concert that in some ways was a kind of French equivalent of Woodstock, that this enormous significant moment that a lot of young French people in the 1960s remember this concert, not just as a financial success as it was for the magazine, but also a kind of a moment of generational success as well. French youth culture, music was obviously very popular. So what often became yay music was essentially a French version of the ya style they associated with the Beatles and other beat music British bands. So we get this growth of French pop as well in the 1960s. And we get changing attitudes towards sex and sexuality. So pictured in the picture here is Brigitte Bardot, who was a French actress who actually in the 1950s had become prominent and had kind of openly spoke about her own sexuality and her own kind of willingness to kind of discuss her relationships with men. That was kind of unusual in the 1950s, but by the 1960s, we get more and more young French people willing to kind of embrace open sexuality and especially sexual relationships outside of marriage, which was something facilitated by the advent of the pill in the early 1960s as well. And what we started to see in the 1960s is that French marriage rates started to drop, French birth rates also start to drop as more and more young French people are more comfortable with kind of casual sexuality, casual sex, and no longer considering sex to be something exclusively retained for marriage. One of the groups that tried to cash in and celebrate this new French culture was Club Mediterranee, Club Med, as it was known. Initially, it was designed to offer cheap holidays for French families, but very quickly began to alter its approach to setting vacations to kind of young single people in their 20s, and oftentimes very much alluded to the fact that this was a place for singles to come, possibly meet, have a good time. This cartoon, the image itself, it was hard to get a really good image, so obviously this is aimed at an Asian market, with the text I assume is Chinese or Japanese. But was another aspect of French, changing French culture, combining new French materialism with more lax attitudes towards sexuality, and essentially selling a product, and combining these things with making attractive vacations available to young French people as well. Having said that, while there was greater liberal attitudes emerging within France towards sex and sexuality, there is also something of a resurgence in the Catholic Church in France during this time period as well. French Catholicism for a long time had been associated as an anti-modern, very, very conservative institution in France, dating back to the Dreyfus Affair in the late 19th century. The experience of the Second World War had helped refuel or helped recreate an emergence of the older, kind of more democratic, liberal tradition of French Catholicism as well, and especially in the role that people in the resistance Catholics had played in overthrowing what they saw as a kind of godless fascism in the form of the Nazis. During the 1950s, the French Church tried to become more proactive in trying to reach out to the industrial masses who essentially were not practicing religion or were very those people who supported, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, who were not really connected with the church. Essentially, what it meant was getting priests, taking them out of their traditional frock, putting them in ordinary work clothes, and sending them to work with ordinary French workers to try and bring the word of Jesus Christ to them in that way. It was a reasonably successful program in France. It was popular amongst French clerics, but actually Pope Pius XII condemned it in 1954, said it was inappropriate. And that kind of solidified the opinion of some people that the French, the church hierarchy was kind of disconnected from the reality of modern life and from the importance of the work that things like the work of priests were doing. Another important French movement in the 1950s was La Jeunesse Agricole Catholique, the Young French Farmers Association. And what they were trying to do was combining, on the one hand, encouraging French farmers to adopt more modernized techniques, more modern techniques of farming to improve their output, while at the same time protecting their traditional rural identity and especially the role of the Catholic Church in that identity as well. So that was a new organization in the 1950s. And I have a Jeopardy question for you guys. So this council, 1962 to 1965, organized by Pope John the 23rd, considered relations between Catholic Church and the modern world. The answers you should have is, what is Vatican II? So Vatican II, if you don't know, was an effort from the Catholic Church to kind of bring Catholic teaching more into line with the modern way of the world. It replaced, for example, Latin with local dialects, local vernaculars as the language of Mass. It also encouraged greater cooperation with Protestants and Jews as opposed to traditional Catholic hostility towards Jews. For a time, there was even a hope that the council itself didn't say it, but it was kind of vague on the question of birth control. Some people even hoped that they would endorse birth control, although in 1968 that the papacy had kind of condemned birth control. But it modernized the French Church, and it kind of encouraged more French young people to see the Catholic Church as a more relevant force in their life, as one that was somewhat more in tune with the needs of the modern world, and therefore was an appropriate or was a welcoming institution to kind of help them deal with the uncertainty of life in the 1960s.